Welcome to the Syria Spectrum. I'm your host, Sami Akil. 1 year after the fall of the Assad regime, Syria is now focused on consolidating state authority. At the center of this effort sits the question of security sector reform. SSR, for short, is not a technical or secondary issue. In post-conflict transitions, it is often the backbone of state building. In Syria's case, how forces organized, professionalized, constrained, and overseen will shape political participation, economic recovery, refugee returns, and long-term stability. Simply put, the future of the transition will be decided by how security is governed. To understand where SSR stands today, it is essential to begin with the inherited reality. Post-Assad Syria did not inherit a unified, functional security sector capable of reform in the first place. Instead, it inherited a fragmented security ecosystem. This includes remnants of former regime intelligence and military services, victorious rebel formations, locally rooted armed groups, criminal and smuggling networks, as well as foreign-backed actors, all operating with varying degrees of autonomy. As a result, the central challenge has not been reforming institutions, but building state security institutions in an environment where force was already politicized. This is why legitimacy in Syria is not primarily shaped by laws or organizational charts. It is shaped by implementation. Security is experienced through daily encounters, at checkpoints, in police conduct, in detention practices, and whether commanders can enforce discipline and accountability. A year into the transition, a clear imbalance has emerged. The transitional leadership has achieved significant international and regional legitimacy. Diplomatic engagements have expanded, and Syria's political isolation has receded. However, this external legitimacy has not yet translated into consistent domestic security consolidation. The state's ability to assert monopoly over the use of force remains uneven across various regions. This gap has generated pressure to centralize authority rapidly, often at the expense of professional standards, legal safeguards, and civilian oversight mechanisms. This tension is most visible in the current approach of integration. Integrating armed groups into the Ministries of Defense and Interior has been a central pillar of reform. In principle, integration is unavoidable. Syria cannot stabilize while parallel armed structures persist. But integration without deeper transformation carries risks. Without unified training standards, professional military education, clear rotation policies, and merit-based promotions, integration risks preserving factional command structures inside the state. Armed groups may adopt official titles while retaining informal chains of command and local loyalties. As such, from an SSR perspective, this undermines the unity of command and increases the risk of fragmentation on the long term. Closely linked to this is the challenge of professionalizing the armed forces. Professionalization is not about appearances. It is about doctrine, discipline, clear rules of engagement, and respect for civilian authority, as well as effective command control. Years of conflict have entrenched wartime behaviors and informal power structures, making this transition particularly difficult. Several technical issues remain central to whether reform succeeds. These include restructuring command relationships between the political leadership and the Ministries of Defense and Interior, ensuring the meaningful inclusion of minorities in security institutions to rebuild trust and legitimacy, as well as addressing the unresolved integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which remains one of the largest obstacles to a nationwide monopoly over the use of force. Underlying all of this is a broader sequencing debate. Should Syria prioritize rapid centralization to prevent fragmentation, or pursue a phased approach that builds legitimacy and institutional capacity alongside authority? This is by no means a debate between unity versus division, but how to avoid reproducing coercive practices in a society shaped by deep mistrust. 1 year into the transition, SSR in Syria stands at a crossroads. Between consolidation and coercion, between international legitimacy and domestic credibility, and more importantly, between short-term control and long-term stability. To discuss the current status of security sector reform in Syria, the ongoing challenges and potential opportunities for reform, I'm pleased to be joined by Gregory Waters. Greg is a researcher at the Syria Archive and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He studies security institutions, civil peace, local governance, and is a leading expert on SSR in Syria. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Sammy.
So, Greg, maybe just give us a quick rundown now. Let's start with the basics. How would you characterize the current status of Syria's security sector 1 year after the fall of the Assad regime? And what are some of the most notable efforts being conducted by the interim government so far?
I think the biggest steps or sort of evolution for the first year was on two fronts. First was integrating all the different armed factions into the MOD, and then reducing the factionalism between these groups and improving professionalism. The second front was on the Ministry of Interior side for the internal security forces, and that was to build outwards a new internal policing security force via sort of targeted recruitment and integration of individuals or small groups from the armed factions. So these are the two. When we talk about security in Syria, those are the two main forces. You also have the intelligence apparatuses, which are, it's much more opaque, but undergoing their own changes. The first year's developments really focused on the structures. Like, what does the army look like? What does the Ministry of Interior look like? And then the sort of the bureaucratic, the internal parts of that. How do you coordinate between an MOI and MOD unit in the field? How do who reports to who? Do we need to add more command layers in this to make things smoother, to improve accountability? So these were the sort of like as a structural changes. And then in more recent months, we start to see that the whole time we're having expansion, there's recruitment, there's vetting, there's firing of people. And I think now we're really entering the phase of really upping the recruitment, dealing with the resource limitations, the manpower limitations, and the training. The training is the other big thing that's sort of come along over the second half of this year.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see the differences between these two institutions when comparing the MOD with the MOI? I think the general consensus is that, at least from what I've been hearing, is that reform efforts within the MOI tend to be much more structured and much more implementable, whereas in the MOD, it tends to be a bit more complicated. And if that's the case, what are the reasons for that, do you think?
Yeah, it's absolutely the case. I think there's a variety of reasons, but I think the most important one is the structures, like the how they were built and how they're used. So again, the MOI I like to describe as being built inward out. It has a very clear mandate. It has a clear sort of day-to-day mission. You're at a checkpoint. You're doing policing. You're supporting other institutions, whether that's supporting the Justice Ministry, supporting police stations, supporting local officials. And you have this really constant friction with the local population that has played a huge role in the sort of, we could call it de-radicalization of individuals. So if you could think of, from the starting point in December 2024, you're pulling the core of both the MOI and MOD are armed fighters, Sunni fighters from the revolution, people who have lost a lot, friends, family that is suffering. There's a lot of anger and hurt there. And the first step the government had to take was for all the country, right, is not to take revenge into your own hands. And what we saw consistently in those first several months was problems of armed men now in the new government using their power to take revenge or to just exploit that power for personal gain. The MOI, because it wasn't built by taking an entire faction and saying, you now have this area, you report to the MOD. It was built by saying, we'll take this group of guys. You have a new commander. This is your job. You're responsible for policing this area. And you have this constant sort of oversight. It allowed them to really instill the behavior and the mandate more consistently. And then because you had that constant friction with civilians, you had people just naturally sort of transition from this mentality of I'm fighting a war for survival, a war for freedom, to I am now a defender of the state. And so as a defender of the state, I oppose whether you're Sunni or Alawi. If you're trying to undermine that state, you're equal. Equal in my eyes, and we really see this in you talk with like MOI members on the ground, how they've changed the way they talk over the months. From, well, I'm doing this because it's my job, but I'm not happy about protecting a minority area. To months later, genuinely feeling like arguing with their friends about like, no, not all minorities support Assad, and all these nuanced takes because they've just interacted more with these communities. This was structurally a big difference. The other reason why the MOI, I think, has had a better evolution is because the core of it, at the lower level core of it, comes from the Idlib General Security Services. And Idlib, if we go back to 2018, 2019, when this Syrian Salvation Government is formed to administer Idlib, they also create a Ministry of Interior, and they create this new police force, General Security Services. And these men had very extensive training, continual training, not just in how to do civil policing, which is different than how to fight a war. And that's been part of the problem, struggles changing to civil policing mindset. But they also had training on laws of war, how to conduct arrests, and a lot of training on just awareness of non-Sunni communities and how to conduct yourselves with them. And this goes back years and years, because you had Christians and Druze in Idlib, but there's also understanding from the leadership that if we're going to take over Syria, we will be governing many non-Sunnis. These commanders, these general security commanders from Idlib, you had maybe 2,000, 2,500 of them. They became that backbone of the sort of command structure within the rest of Syria. So now you have even like a low-level official for a sub-district. He has that background. He was in the police academy in Idlib. He has this training, and he's able to impart that on his men. On the army side, you did have these similar kinds of training at the military academy in Idlib, but it seems to have been more for higher level officers. So you don't have it takes more time for that mentality to dilute itself down to the very base level, and it's a different mandate. It's a different, you're coming from factions that have different histories, different mentalities, different ideologies. It's a much slower process to change the mentality and to say, well, what is our mandate? Our mandate is to defend the state from external enemies. Well, that can be interpreted in so many different ways. And, when you basically have one moment of being used, whether that's March 6th, May, July, you don't have this daily use where you can kind of tweak things, you can kind of change mentalities, you can find out that someone is not fit for the job and fire them or reprimand them or retrain them. So the moments that the MOD get used are they're higher stakes, they're much more sensitive, and it's kind of like it's a test run and the use case at the same moment, and then we see everything blow up.
Mm-hmm. And what do you, to what extent do you think the ideology component is also linked to that? From your understanding, do you see that members of the MOD tend to have maybe less of a understanding to the concept of serious diversity, for example, or more radical views than the MOI? And which of those two ministries or governance entities do you think has been more actively recruiting new individuals, perhaps?
The ideology is an interesting aspect because you have different perspectives on the role it plays when it comes to crimes and violations. I tend to think that I think there's a researcher who used a really good phrase that the violence has become mainstream. So yes, in the MOD, you're going to have a wider ideological spectrum. You're going to have people who are more extremist, or who are more conservative, come from the more hardcore opposition backgrounds. At the same time, we've seen for years, right? What is the SNA? I mean, it has a wide ideological breadth, and a lot of the crimes being committed by SNA groups were committed by essentially, as secular as you could get, opposition factions. So the same thing on March 6th, right? We have Amshat, Hamzat do crimes just the same as Ansar Tawhid is doing crimes. They're both executing Alawis, and they are on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. So yes, in the MOD, you have this greater range, but I don't know that is directly related to the amount of crimes and the lack of professionalism that you see across different units. I think that has more is more to do with just how these different factions, now we call them brigades and divisions, are instituting the training practices and the command and control within their own organizations. So if you have a group, whether it's an extremist group or a group like Amshat or Hamzat, that where the leadership doesn't want to or doesn't know how to enforce discipline, then that's the problem. Like that's when you have this breakdown in control. Now on the MOI side, they did incorporate groups like units from the opposition factions early on to quickly build up the ranks, but then they've just been mostly doing direct recruitment from the civilian population, and integration of former MOI members, whether they're defectors or not, from the former regime. So part of the process, part of the training, the bulk of the training, that initial training, is on ideology. It's on morals. I mean, you have almost half of every day's training is essentially morality lessons with a sheikh, or this is how it was earlier this year with the religious sheikh. And I mean, it goes over the very basics of Islam, but it's not an Islamic course. What it is, it's about teaching. It's about rooting morality in the members' own beliefs, which is Islam, to really ground this. And so a lot of it is like Q&As essentially, where people say, if I encounter an Alawi at a checkpoint, what do I do? The Imam will say, well, did they do something wrong? If not, then nothing. You do nothing. Like that, they are just another Syrian. It's these kinds of like basic things, because you have so many people, especially on the MOI, where you have so many younger people. The main recruitment age is in that mid to early 20s. These were children during the war. So their experiences with outside their community after 2011 is essentially non-existent. So it just takes it's about education, and I think that MOI it doesn't struggle with it's not coming from a starting point of as much radicalization, and like I said, it has that mandate and that lower level oversight to kind of keep keep changing the beliefs and keep working on how people act.
So going back or touching on the topic of professionalism that you mentioned earlier, what do you see are the same or the key challenges to the professionalism within the MOD itself, and how much of a restructuring process is actually currently underway, and what are the limitations for that when you think about specific factions you mentioned? The Sultan Sulaiman Shah, Amshad, Hamzat, these brigades, which obviously their commanders and entities were recently also imposed on the sanctions list by a couple of countries. What do you see the main challenges of that, and how do you see also the interaction between them and the top brass of the Syrian leadership currently taking shape?
I think the professionalism for the MOD, the approach to it is as a part of a broader restructuring of the training systems and the actual forces themselves. So if we look at the first year, like I said, the first year for the MOD has been about taking all the factions, they essentially getting them to pledge allegiance to the new government, that we're not going to be independent. We report to the MOD. It's honestly the exact same process that's been going on with the SDF. And if you actually look at the details of how they're playing out, what Damascus is trying to do with the Syrian Democratic Forces is exactly what they did with the opposition faction. So they met with Shara and Abu Qasra, the Minister of Defense, early on. They had meetings. They accepted that the Ministry of Defense would be in charge. Then they submit personnel records and equipment records to say, this is how large my faction is. At the same time, a committee was formed to create the structure of a new army on paper. Say, okay, we're going to have X number of divisions. They're going to have these kinds of brigades, these kinds of battalions. These are going to be the numbers. And then they took those personnel records and they took that army structure and they matched them. So, okay, your faction has 2,000 guys. That's a brigade. So we'll put you in this brigade. And then if most of your faction members are from this governorate, well, that's the governorate you're going to be based in. For larger factions like Suleiman Shah, it was large enough that it's going to become an entire division. So the creation of it is a negotiation of power, in the sense that Suleiman Shah is a very large faction with a lot of power. So they did take some members of it away for other parts of the army, other parts of the MOI. They took away some of the equipment, but at the end of the day, it's a large faction with its own substructures. So we're just going to put it into a division, and its leader stays in. And these are all negotiations of power at the end of in reality. I don't think the MOD would admit that, but that's what it is. that's the first year, right? We're building these structures. Now, going forward, they've also been rehabilitating the training colleges. So this is for the officer schools and the non-commissioned officer schools. These are the things that turn, this opposition factions into a more formal army where, yeah, a lot of these people have field expertise, but they don't have that academic military expertise. And now it's about combining those two and creating true officers to lead the army. And I suspect what we're going to see over the next year is replacement of some of these commanders who don't have a formal military background with newly trained officers. You have classes now going through the military academies, and the first senior officer course is underway. When they graduate, you're going to have like official brigadiers and colonels, and I suspect we will see them start to replace some of these other guys who were technically given ranks early on in the beginning of 2025, like somewhat unofficial ranks. Now that the academies are in place, those ranks aren't official because they haven't actually earned them through college, right? So that's going to be a big change.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's kind of, well, I wonder if that will apply also to the Minister of Defense, because to the best of my knowledge, he is also I think an agricultural engineer by profession, and it will be interesting if that holds up for him.
I believe he went through the military academy in Idlib. I know. I met him in 2022, and he was talking about the military academy. And at one point, he said, once I finish, then I'll have this rank, and my name will be different than it is now. Like, that was before liberation. So, but yeah, this is the other challenge they've had, right? Is how do you train all of these people when you're also facing threats, and you can't just take an entire command chain of a division and bring it to an academy. So this has been part of the reason why we see. I think it's one reason why it's been a slower process of professionalization is the current system has really relied on taking trainers or taking individuals from each of these units, so essentially from these factions, testing them, and a central committee that's in charge of this, selects, okay, these 10 guys from this division they've tested the highest scores. They'll come to the training academy and they get trained as trainers. Then they'll go back to their division and they'll run the training courses. Theoretically, this creates a homogenous training system for every division without having to bring everyone to a central location and taking guys off the line, or you also don't have enough space to bring all those people to one central location. So this was a big process. This second half of this year was training trainers under a single consolidated system to then go back to their divisions. And again, there's a ton of bureaucratic bodies that have been created within the MOD for this. And what's been so interesting is to see that pretty much all of these are being led now by pretty high-ranking defected officers from the regime.
Interesting. And I guess the gist of what you're getting is that the main challenge was basically to change the tire of a car while keeping the car running to some extent.
Exactly.
I feel like that's kind of the main challenge that the MOD particularly has been facing, and to some extent as well the MOI. But what interests me now, I think, would be also potentially see your perspective on which regional actors have been directly involved in the restructuring process of the Ministry of Defense. I think the notable actors are probably Turkey and Qatar, but I've also heard that for example, Jordan and Saudi Arabia have been directly involved also with when it comes to border guards and the MOI in general. So, what is your take on that, and to what extent does having too many cooks burn the dish? Are you seeing that there's any competition being formed, or is the security apparatus being factionalized in some sense because this entity receives backing from this regional actor and this entity believes gets from another foreign actor? What do you think of this assessment?
Yeah, it's so far the core restructuring seems to be essentially Syrian driven. Where we see a lot of the external support is coming through financial support to the institutions for salaries, and then training on specific units. So Turkey training, taking a batch of officers for counterterrorism training academy. The Jordanians, for the foreign ministry, Jordanians training diplomats. The Qataris were helping with counter narcotics training. Another batch of officers went to Saudi. I don't know for what, but so you seem to have these quite small like batches of officers going to these foreign countries for multi-year training courses. I mean, the Turkey one I think is a 3-year training course. The Saudi one is a bit, and Qatari ones are a lot shorter. So I think it's too early to say or to see if there's any sort of factionalism that comes from having these sort of foreign backers. That would be maybe something that would arise in the coming years as these sort of officer courses that get trained abroad then return to Syria to presumably lead new departments, do their own trainings, that kind of thing. But I mean, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I would be surprised if there's much interest from these countries in trying to do too much factionalism and patronage networks within the current institutions. And I would suspect that, I mean, when we hear the leaders in Damascus, when we hear their reflections on the war, right, that number one thing has been the way the factionalism and the divisions between the groups just so consistently undermine the revolution. So this idea of avoiding that or of nipping it in the bud before it gets big, I think would be quite prominent. And like I said, in the end of the day, the main institutions seem to be very Syrian-driven.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the issue of foreign fighters, I know we saw a couple of brigades, particularly the Uyghur foreign fighter brigades, factions rather, like the TIP. How are you sensing their integration into the Syrian security apparatus? And do you sense that this is causing any issues, or do they tend to be one of the lesser problematic factions or divisions, rather, that are being integrated into the security apparatus? I'm assuming obviously not into the MOI, because I think, as you mentioned, more face-to-face, so probably having foreign or non-native Arabic-speaking individuals in the MOI might be counterproductive. But within the MOD, how do you see that transform so far?
Yeah, it's definitely not an MOI. And within the MOD, you have basically two tracks. The smaller foreign groups that have been integrated already into groups like Ahrar Sham or HTS before liberation. They just stayed, if they were integrated into a HTS brigade, and that brigade later on joined a division, those foreign fighters are in that division still. And these would be, we'd be talking about like groups of less than 100 men. These are very small. There's really not that many foreign fighters in Syria. The largest, the two segments that have not been or were not initially integrated into the MOD was, like you said, the Turkestani Islamic Party, the Uyghurs, and then the Caucasian guys, which generally just called Chechens, but Dagestanis, Chechens, anyone from the Caucasus. And it's very hard to get numbers on things, but the most accurate that I've heard is maybe 3,500 Uyghur fighters. I think we hear a larger number when people include the families, but the fighters is 3,500, and maybe a few hundred at most of the Caucasus fighters. So those were the ones that were for a long time not integrated. It wasn't clear what would happen with them, and then it was okay. We're going to put them in their own division, led by a very trusted Uyghur commander, the head of the TIP. In the first half of last year or of 2025, there was a lot of problems being caused by a lot of fear, mostly being caused by having foreign fighters deployed to the coast or in homes. Sometimes they caused problems when they were in these areas, whether that was like just harassing people or stealing. There was, I think, if any, very few reported cases of them killing anyone during these, outside of the events of the March 6th massacres and what happened in Sweda. But they did get removed from the coast because they were causing too many problems. As I understand now, that core division of the Uyghurs and the Caucasian fighters, they're in Idlib. That's where they're kept. The ones who were long time integrated into the MOD, they're just deployed wherever their unit is deployed. But in general, we've seen the MOD just consistently being withdrawn from civilian areas. This has been just a consistent pattern since December of 2024. As the MOI gets larger, it takes over checkpoints, it takes over policing. The MOD gets removed back to bases. The presence of these bases still causes a lot of fear. You still have problems where men will leave the bases and cause problems, whether they're foreign fighter or not. That's again on to command and control issues. But this has been a gradual process of removing it, which just further reduces the interaction of foreigners with non-foreign with Syrians who aren't used to them.
And I think touching back, you mentioned earlier, obviously the elephant in the room, for which actually the whole topic of security sector reform became such a important topic in Syria's landscape today. Obviously, the coastal massacres and the massacres or in Sweden. Do you see that the underlying issues were very similar, i.e., when the situation deteriorated following the intervention of the Ministry of Defense in both incidences? And are there any differences in both massacres or both events that you would like to maybe share from your personal insight?
I think they are quite different events. The one similarity would be, again, that command and control, the lack of it or the difficulty of it, whether that's within a unit or from above to the unit. So this is not to say that an entire unit commander could have been ordering massacres, but that certainly happened. And that sometimes, though, even within that unit, individuals were doing these things on their own. However, the coastal massacres, I think, were quite different than Sueda. It was far more chaotic, far less just in general. A lot of the factions that went there weren't even in the MOD officially yet, or they were still in the process of joining the MOD. And you had a lot more just non-government forces, local Sunnis, external Sunnis involved in the massacres. And they were, I think you could say, in a sense, that it was more of a targeted, indiscriminate killings. One of the things I don't think has been covered very well on the coastal massacres is why some villages were massacred, others not. And there's a fairly consistent pattern, not universal, but fairly consistent pattern where, because it began with an insurgent uprising against the security forces that were already in the coast, everyone who was coming, they knew which checkpoints had been attacked. And so then they go to the town outside that checkpoint was outside of, they go to that town and then kill all the men. Right. So and they bypass every other town. Sueda seemed to be different. Sueda, and for Sueda, I've mostly just worked on looking at what units went to Sueda, not at the sort of detailed timeline like I have in the coast. But for Sueda, it seemed to be more of sort of this entire area is viewed as having risen up, whereas in the coast, despite what you maybe see how it's framed online, there really was perception of not having a perception that the entire area has risen up. That's only some areas rose up.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at the end of the day, I do think there's quite a big difference. Sueda, if we're talking about from the MOD's command and control and professionalism perspective, I think Sueda is more concerning than the coastal massacres was.
And I think to some extent, I mean, obviously the numbers and the events both were quite horrible, but I think in both incidents, in Sueda, I think was much more detrimental and much more embarrassing as well for the Syrian government on a number of scales. But I think the key question to me when it comes to when trying to analyze the aftermath of both of these events is, it's going to take a lot of effort now from both the MOI and MOD in terms of rebuilding those ties in order to effectively recruit people from those two communities or governorates, so to speak. To what extent are you seeing now, actual efforts to incorporate minorities into the Syrian security apparatus? And is it largely symbolic or is it genuine? And how can the Syrian government and Western donors or the international community support those efforts?
Right. So there's two parts to this. The first is the government itself addressing internally what happened, and this is one of the things where for a variety of reasons that you can agree with or disagree with, they have not made public, is that there has been extensive internal accountability, which is different than external accountability, on both March 6th and July 14th, and every incident in between. So you've had hundreds of people arrested, hundreds of soldiers and MOI members arrested from both events. You have some very interesting internal accountability mechanisms that support essentially like within a unit holding each other accountable, being able to report on violations committed by your colleague anonymously to commanders. These things are ongoing. The problem is that the arrests or the initial discipline of violators is seen by victims sometimes, but the follow-up is not seen. So if we take the coast, for example, right after March 6th, you had a period of a lot of violations that were initially occurring from a lot of the government forces and also from Sunni civilians coming in. Gradually, it became more violations being committed by Sunni civilians. But you still, around June and July, you would have these like kind of every week or two an incident where a patrol would go into an area and someone in the patrol would kill a local, a civilian, right? Or you'd have a guy at checkpoint killed. And what you started to consistently hear was when that happened, that man would be arrested. And the locals would say, yeah, okay, he was arrested. We don't see him anymore. But we don't know what happened to him after his arrest. Was he jailed? Was he given a slap on the wrist? What happened? But that was the first step in building trust in minority areas, in the coast, right? Was when these people are doing crimes, they get arrested. And that also helped to instill professionalism and behavior change within the units. They're now being held accountable. So in the coast, it varies a huge amount between the different Alawi areas, whether you're talking about Hama, Homs, Tartus, Latakia, Damascus. But generally speaking, the MOI has built trust over the second half of 2025 through this accountability that is still only semi-opaque, semi-transparent, but also through behavior change. The checkpoints are treating locals much better. The local officials are engaging with locals much more. You have the creation and empowerment of, in some places, civil peace committees and civil councils that bring local influential actors into close communication and coordination with local officials, security officials, to help address any problems or any complaints or fears that people might have. In some areas, those systems are more genuine. In other areas, they're more co-opted by the government and they're less effective. So all of this has helped to build trust to varying degrees in different areas. How that's transferred into recruitment, the MOD does not have recruitment of non-Sunnis, as far as I know. I've not heard of a single case. Okay. The MOI is and has been recruiting non-Sunnis for many months now. They've recruited like fresh recruits. For example, in Tartus, you had, because the situation was better than in Latakia, you had more Alawis youth willing to volunteer to join. In Latakia, it's far less the case, though there seems to be at least some that have joined. And I heard back as far as February, I had heard of like Alawi youth from Latakia city joining the police and going to get training from their friends. They told me that, not from officials. So, but really, it's been the last like 2 or 3 months where we've seen these non-Sunni men start to be deployed now into, for example, Tartus governorate. The next step that's also ongoing is the identification of regime-era Ministry of Interior officers. So a detective, police officer, anything that has a good record, that is trusted, and rehiring them. And that's also begun. And they are,
they did that with the police force quite frequently. I think that was the first step. And now, hearing from you, detectives, maybe that will also trickle up to the military one day, I guess. But yeah, sorry.
I think so traffic police was the first time they did this, right? Traffic police is also, it's easy because these are unarmed men. Everyone's saying bring them, exactly. But it took a lot longer for general security, regular police, like armed units. And initially, in the first months, you would hear a lot of officials saying, regardless of my personal opinion of having minorities in the security forces, if we hire them and we bring them in, and there is a single incident where either a Sunni guy or an Alawi guy shoots each other, like everything blows up, right? So it's just this massive fear of this, of just a lack of coexistence. And that, I think this is the biggest sign of these internal ideological changes that have been made in the MOI, is that you now have armed Alawite general security in that office with armed Sunni general security, and they all work together, and they all like, and they're hiring more. They're expanding this. I don't think it's symbolic, and one reason I don't think it's symbolic is that it was not announced for months that this was happening. Like, the first thing we saw on social media about it was that video from the Latakia graduation last week.
Yeah, there was an Alawite. They did an interview with an Alawite officer, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. But this has been going on for months before that. I mean, not just being recruited, but being trained, graduated, and integrated into the forces. So I do think it's a real positive change, but it's also worth highlighting that the challenge of recruiting non-Sunnis, and especially Alawis, and I think we'll see the same thing with Druze from Sueda, is not just on the government. It's also on the communities they come from. There are some communities where, like, I've gone to Alawi activists there.
There's a stigma.
Asked, there's a stigma. It's not just a stigma. There's a danger. I've asked, like, has anyone from here joined the MOI? And these are activists that, like, I'm a media activist who all I do is post on Facebook what's happening, which oftentimes counters the pro-insurgent narratives, and I get death threats every day. If a man from my village joined the MOI, he would be executed immediately. So this is a challenge. But I will say, for the Druze, if you look in Jaramana, there are Druze in general security. They've been in there for many months in Jaramana. If you remember, initially in Sahnaya and Jaramana, it was Druze checkpoint, general security checkpoint. They're now integrated. Yeah. It's just one checkpoint. So again, like, this has been some areas. It seems to go more further than other areas. It definitely seems to be somewhat up to each governorate how they want to pursue this, which is why we don't see it consistently, a consistent process everywhere. But it is happening.
Well, I think the real question now, I think, which will probably be circulating for the next couple of weeks, you mentioned sensitivities. I think the big sensitivity now is the integration of the SDF, and I think that's the other elephant in the room on how to address that. For me personally, I find it hard to believe that the integration of SDF military elements into the Syrian armed apparatus or the Syrian MOD will be smoothly. Like, to be really honest with you, like, personally, I feel like like a brigade composed of Amshat and a brigade composed of SDF manning the same checkpoint, it seems a bit unrealistic at the current state. So I think the question here is, where do you see the integration? Obviously, there's a lot of chatter now that, we're close to signing a deal or implementing the March 10th agreement. But what do you see the main security considerations from both sides being, and how would that reflect on the overall topic of security sector reform in Syria, in your opinion?
I think the one positive thing for the SDF integration is that if you follow the system that was used for the factions, you are addressing most of the genuine concerns with the SDF. If we take their face value concerns, which is that we want localization, we don't want outsiders imposed on us. That's how the MOD was formed. Everything in Syria is localized. It is semi-decentralized. It is localized. So all of those concerns would be addressed if we just keep following that process. The difference is that at least some, if not all of the SDF leadership, what they actually want is autonomy of their forces. They want a Peshmerga, they want a KRG situation. Now, that's obviously a red line for them, for Damascus. So if we talk about what's Damascus's main concern, it's about ensuring that there are no armed groups outside of their control. So you can have 3 divisions, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, that are made up of locals, that are made up of the SDF units already there. But those, how those divisions report to the MOD, that's for negotiation. Is the division commander appointed by Damascus, or is he from the SDF? These are things that are honestly not that hard to negotiate. For the SDF, if we look at what could be more genuine concerns, if we take away the autonomy part, like you said, it's, well, what happens if we have a Raqqa division here, or we have a Deir ez-Zor division here, and then you have Ahrar Sharqiya across the river because they have a division in Deir ez-Zor as well.
Yeah.
So how do we ensure that division, those members, aren't going to come over here and start causing problems? And again, that's where when you put this question to Damascus, they say, well, all of these divisions are under our control. They can't, Abu Shakra, the head of Ahrar Sharqiya, he can't move his units anywhere on his own. Only the MOD senior leadership can order that, which is, I mean, that's how it should work in reality. But okay, we've seen now multiple cases of either you ordering massacres or guys ignoring your orders and doing massacres, right? So this is the concern. So I think these aren't that complicated, because you can just start by saying, the Damascus has authority over the Northeast units, but below that, units can't move. Like, you can't have the 86th Division move into the Northeast. You can't have, Ahrar Sharqiya go over there, because it's not their area of control. It's not their area of responsibility. The other thing is that the nice thing about the Northeast is it's because the Kurdish areas are so far up along the border and everything else is an Arab area. I really don't see such a big risk of sort of ethnic massacres or sectarian massacres. To me, the security concern for the Northeast for integration is revenge killings from the different families and communities that have been split for so long, because that Euphrates River Valley area had so many different loyalties, such a complex and bloody history throughout the war of people who were
a lot of change of hands as well.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then you have, this long time split now where half the community left to the northwest, half the community stayed on the SDF. Making sure you don't have, when you reintegrate these communities, when you have return of IDPs, you have locals now being recruited back into these new forces, ensuring that people aren't using that moment to take out revenge killings on each other. So I think I don't see such a large risk of like Kurdish massacres, because the Kurdish communities are so far from the current border. And you would have two semi-SDF divisions in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor between the other guys, between Amshat, Ahrar Sharqiya, etc., and Kamishli. So I think it's and these sorts of things, he's dealing with intercommunal, like tribal conflicts. The government's clearly attempting to create systems for that with their new tribal affairs committee and having Ahmed Zakur go around and deal with all this. So I guess to summarize it is that I think that it's not as complex as it maybe is sometimes framed, but it does still come down to will the SDF engage in a legitimate, genuine manner, and is Damascus willing to bend on some things to address some of the more legitimate concerns?
Yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, you see it more of a political issue rather than being a technical issue.
I think the technical aspects of it are solved. Like the systems they're not solved, but the systems to address the technical aspects are very clear. They're not that complex. Mm-hmm. It's about politics.
It's about politics. Makes sense. Well, to wrap things up, I think looking ahead, I'd like to have your take and maybe give some advice to the policymakers who are tuning in to hear this episode. What are some of the maybe 2 or 3 security sector reform priorities that must be tackled in the next couple of months to prevent fragmentation and consolidate state control in Syria? So what is your opinion on that, and what do you think needs to be done in a realistic manner?
I think for outside actors, international community, there has to be continuing and expanding support for the MOI. I mean, the MOI is gaining trust. It's clearly proven its professionalism. There's obviously still issues, but they're being addressed, and there's constant improvement. So it's empowering the MOI so that it can continue to take over responsibilities that the MOD is filling in right now. Giving the space and then the support for the MOD to continue to do the internal structural reform. So that means supporting the rehabilitation of the military academies so that you can have a professionally trained officer corps that then starts to take over all the units. I don't think the factionalism of units is so much of an issue right now as the behavior. So trying to identify more exactly where are behavior problems stemming from, and how can we address that? And there are coordination and accountability mechanisms that exist, and they're good. They're not being universally used, and that seems to be a result of a lack of training for mid-level officials, whether from the MOI and MOD. So again, training support is huge. Training officials, MOI officials MOD officials on civil policing, helping these guys move out of the mindset of war into a civil policing, civil state. Anything like that is helpful. I think the biggest thing is buying time, right? Preventing outbreaks of chaos where everything, this fragile stability collapses. And so we see now with the international coalition working with Damascus against ISIS, this is really important. Well, obviously, ISIS is trying to be on the upswing again, but there's clearly being able to do a lot of operations. We need to see this support expand now to countering the Assad insurgents, because we saw what happened on March 6th, and even the months before March 6th. The pro-Assad, the remnants, whatever you want to call them, the Alawi insurgents in the coastal areas want to create instability. They want to trigger those Sunni mobilization against the Alawi community. We saw that with today's protests, the fact that armed men joined the protests, firing on security forces. There needs to be work, obviously, on making sure the Sunni community doesn't overreact to these instigations. But the government is in a war against an armed insurgency. And the more the international community can help it in intelligence, gathering, preventing the flow of weapons and money into the coast to expand these networks, that will help prevent these sorts of instigatory attacks and destabilizing events that then potentially open the door to new sectarian massacres.
Amazing. Oh, very useful stuff. Thank you very much, Greg, for your time. Really appreciate it. That was Gregory Waters, a researcher with the Syria Archive and a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East program, sharing his insights and assessment on the security sector reform in Syria. As a reminder, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the position of the Syria Spectrum, the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or the Change for Syria Network. A sincere thank you for our great production program and research team for their dedication. Syria Spectrum podcast is produced with the support of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and in partnership with the Change for Syria Network. I'm your host, Sam Akil, and this is the Syria Spectrum, bringing you policies or perspectives.